Hello, my name is Kyle Thomas with the Armchair Historian. This is part 2 of my 3-part series on the Achaemenid Persian Empire. In part 1, I gave an overview of the history of the Persian Empire, and in this video, I will discuss one of the most crucial empire-building strategies the Achaemenids employed. Now, I noted in part 1 that the Persian Empire was remarkably stable. This is considering that it stretched from the west coast of the Black Sea to the Indus River Valley for over 200 years. Now, the rapid pace at which the empire expanded was also remarkable, considering that it went from a small Iranian kingdom to the largest empire in the world in only about 50 years. Few other empires can boast such rapid growth followed by such stable longevity. Most can only claim one or the other. The empires of Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan, for example, reached their greatest heights in 10 and 73 years, respectively. Now, Alexander's collapsed almost immediately after his death, while the Mongol Empire held on for about 20 years after reaching its zenith, before splitting apart, and about 94 years in total. At the other end of the spectrum, the Roman Empire surpassed the Persians in terms of longevity, enduring for over 1,200, or if you count the Eastern Empire, which I always do, over 2,000 years. But their rise was far more gradual. Rome didn't expand outside of Italy until almost 500 years after the city's founding, and it took over 800 years for their empire to reach its greatest territorial extent. So, if most empires that spread quickly fall apart just as fast, and most empires that last take centuries to build, what made Persia the exception? Well, no 15-minute video can fully answer that question. But some of the most crucial factors contributing to the empire's success were its culture and policy of tolerance and inclusion, its sophisticated infrastructure and communication systems, and an efficient system of distributed rule under the satraps. These empire-building techniques are all fascinating in their own right. But in this video, I'm going to focus on their multicultural policy, and how it was reflected and reinforced in their imperial propaganda. While modern historical narratives tend to downplay or just ignore it, more on that in part 3, the Persian Empire was remarkably tolerant and inclusive of the many different cultures, religions, and ethnicities among its subjects. As noted in part 1, Cyrus the Great is remembered in the Hebrew Bible as a Messiah figure, who allowed the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and build the Second Temple. This move was part of a larger effort by Cyrus to repatriate exiled and displaced people in the territories he conquered. Further emperors continued Cyrus's humanistic policies, allowing all inhabitants of the Persian Empire to keep to their native faith and culture, so long as they paid their taxes. Cyrus and his descendants even used royal funds to repair or expand altars and holy sites in various conquered cities. Now, this policy of tolerance was most likely not the result of humanistic goodwill on the part of the Achaemenids. It played into the propaganda that Achaemenid rulers used to justify their rule. Imperial propaganda was a crucial component of the Achaemenid ruling strategy. Soon after a new Achaemenid emperor took the throne, he would typically mark the occasion with a propaganda blitz, announcing the reforms he was making, the victories he had won, and the divine support he had for his reign. The two most famous surviving examples of this practice are the Cyrus cylinder, put out by Cyrus the Great, and the Behistun inscription, commissioned by Darius the Great. These propaganda pieces both emphasize the righteousness of the emperor, the impiety of the emperor's enemies, and the divine right of the emperor to rule. Both also exhibit a particular feature of the Achaemenids' approach to empire building, which contributed greatly to their success. Now first, let's look at the Cyrus cylinder, created after Cyrus conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The text on the cylinder begins by describing the evil of the former Babylonian king, Nabonidus. Cyrus mentions that Nabonidus was a bad king, who brought ruin upon his people with a yoke without relief, but he places more emphasis than that on the fact that Nabonidus had turned away from and offended Marduk, the chief deity in the Babylonian pantheon. According to Cyrus, Marduk sought out a worthy ruler to replace Nabonidus and picked Cyrus for the job. He blessed Cyrus's efforts, and it was with Marduk's aid that Cyrus was victorious. Cyrus then describes how he set right everything that Nabonidus had done wrong. He brought peace to the cities sacred to Marduk and set their people free by going to war with those cities and killing those people. He fixed up the ruined temples there and restored their sacred images, thus proving the divine sanction of his conquest. Now, as with all propaganda, it's hard to say if any of this was true, but we can see here how Cyrus is using tolerance and inclusivity to justify his conquest and rule. Of course he has a right to be in charge. Look at all the cool stuff he did for all the oppressed minorities. In the Cyrus cylinder, we can clearly see Cyrus patting himself on the back for helping the downtrodden Babylonians. But there's something else he does in the inscription that demonstrates that key piece I mentioned of Persian multicultural propaganda strategy. The god that blessed Cyrus's conquest, according to him, was Marduk. Now, Marduk was a Babylonian deity, not a Persian one. This is important because the Cyrus cylinder was made in Babylon to justify Cyrus's conquest of the Babylonian Empire. Cyrus wasn't coming to the Babylonians claiming the support of a foreign god, but that of Marduk, a deity the Babylonians already knew and revered. This is the cornerstone of Persian multicultural policy. Persian emperors would present and legitimize themselves differently to each culture and civilization that they conquered, according to the unique culture and religion of that region. And this tactic makes sense. If you want a group of people to accept your rule, you don't come as a foreign conqueror imposing your will. You convince them in terms that make sense to them that you are their rightful ruler, continuing the traditions and institutions that already existed. Cyrus's practice of this localized legitimization in the Cyrus cylinder went beyond religion. Many elements of the text, including the denouncement of the previous king, the new king taking his place by divine will, setting right his predecessors' wrongs, and repairing old temples, were all long-standing Mesopotamian traditions for legitimizing one's rule. Cyrus was clearly very knowledgeable about the traditions and cultural norms in the regions he conquered, and he went to great lengths to adhere to these traditions and norms as much as possible. In so doing, he minimized the disruption to the locals' way of life, and thus minimized the unrest caused by his conquest. Cyrus's successors carried on this tradition. While we know relatively little about his son Cambyses II, we do know that after he conquered Egypt, he followed the same policy of localized legitimization that his father had carried out in Babylon. He styled himself as the new pharaoh, taking the titles King of Upper and Lower Egypt, and declaring himself to be the descendant of the gods Ra, Horus, and Osiris. He issued propaganda claiming that he was of Egyptian descent, and that his mother was the daughter of a previous pharaoh. In his coronation ceremony as pharaoh, he was crowned according to an Egyptian ritual, and made sacrifices to Egyptian gods. Just like his father, Cambyses knew that in order to minimize disruption and unrest among a conquered people, the best strategy is to convince them that they haven't been conquered at all. Now, in the case of Darius the Great's Behistun inscription, we can see an interesting example of this propaganda philosophy used to legitimize the emperor's rule, not in the eyes of conquered foreigners, but in the eyes of Persians. The Behistun inscription is a massive carved relief that Darius had carved into the side of Mount Behistun in western Iran. It's a propaganda piece like the others, but the audience Darius is trying to sway, unlike in the other examples, is native Persians. As discussed in Part 1, Darius's ascent to the throne was contentious. Cambyses II, while still in Egypt, was ousted from power by his younger brother Bardia. After Cambyses died, Darius overthrew Bardia and established himself as emperor. Having broken the line of succession, Darius had to prove to his subjects that he had the right to rule, just as in the case of his predecessors. Like them, he appealed to the Persian people's religion, affirmed his connection to previous rulers, and conformed to their cultural values. Darius declares multiple times in the inscription that his actions as ruler have been blessed by Ahura Mazda, the god of the Persian Zoroastrian faith. Zoroastrianism is complex and fascinating enough to warrant its own series, but for the purposes of this video, there are 2 points to know about the faith. The main, and kind of only, it's complicated, god of Zoroastrianism is Ahura Mazda, the source of all goodness and order in the universe. Ahura Mazda's enemy is Achaemenid, who is the source of all evil and chaos, most importantly, deception. Deception, or drush, is one of the cardinal sins in Zoroastrianism, and to lie or deceive people is one of the worst crimes one can commit. Now, that's an incredibly basic oversimplification of the doctrine, but it's all you need to know to understand Darius's strategy with the Behistun inscription. In the text of the inscription, Darius begins by laying out the lineage of Achaemenid kings to which he belongs. In it, he claims to be a direct descendant of Tiespes, Cyrus the Great's great-grandfather, and through him of Achaemenes, founder of the Achaemenid line. Now, no older records, including Cyrus's genealogy, mention Achaemenes, so take this element of the genealogy with a grain of salt. Regardless, it was meant to establish the legitimacy of Darius's claim to the throne. But wait, you might say, wasn't the guy Darius overthrew also a descendant of the same line, and therefore just as legitimate? Darius addresses that point shortly afterwards. You see, the man he overthrew was not Bardia at all, but a deceiver, pretending to be him. See, Darius claims that Cambyses II had his brother murdered in secret when he took the throne in order to secure his own power. This secrecy backfired, as the fact that no one knew Bardia was dead allowed a power-hungry priest named Gaumata to impersonate Bardia and take the throne. Now, this is a common theme for Darius. Further on in the inscription, he calls out 9 other leaders who rebelled against him as impostors, leading people to rebel based on lies and deception. Convenient, isn't it, that everyone who opposed his rule was a lying impostor and therefore directly opposed to Ahura Mazda? Darius goes on to assert the righteousness of his actions, and the righteousness of creating and sharing this record of his deeds, done with the blessing, he reminds us, of Ahura Mazda. Through this inscription, no doubt copied and disseminated throughout Persia, Darius asserted the legitimacy and righteousness of his rule. Given that he went on to reign for 36 years and acquire the title the Great, it's clear he was successful in doing that. The Achaemenid emperors of the Persian Empire built their vast multi-ethnic empire with a wide variety of effective forward-thinking tools. Their multicultural policy was only one of these, but it played a crucial role in ensuring the stability of the empire. By justifying and legitimizing their rule in careful, deliberate ways tailored to each of the different cultures that they conquered, the Achaemenid emperors were able to present themselves to all of their subjects as legitimate, rightful successors to the local rulers whom they had replaced. Life went on for people under the Persian Empire, and all that changed was the name of the man on the throne. This stability was crucial in allowing the Persians to conquer as much as they did in as little time, and hold on to it for over 200 years. In the third and final part of this series, I'll discuss the sources we have about the Achaemenid Empire, and the history of Persian history. For now, thank you for watching. I'm Kyle Thomas, with the Armchair Historian.